Chapter 24, continuing everything that we started, of course, especially going back to chapter 18, talking about how we have a hidden love for God within us and love and fear / within us, going into how do we call upon it, how do we tap into it. Well, first we have to understand God within the universe. God is it. Everything is Him, the turtle in the shell. God's inner will and external will. God wanted Torah mitzvahs to be fulfilled. That's why He created the world. So everything is secondary to the actual point of creation. It's either there to assist us or to create challenges for us. But the main point are Torah mitzvahs. Last chapter, we say what actually happens when we fulfill Torah mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, that's doing God's will, creating a home for Him on this world. We're actually fulfilling the purpose of creation. And Torah, we achieve this great unity, this absolute unity with God when we study Torah. So now we go to this chapter. Torah mitzvahs unite us with God. God is everything. So when we do Torah mitzvahs, that's an affirmation of saying God is, and that's it. There is none other. Torah mitzvahs, it's how we express that. I want to unite with you, connect with you, / love you, so I'm going to do what you want. So that's how we have the unity with God. So what happens? God forbid someone does what they're not supposed to do. And not just that, but how can we come about to the point where someone will do what they're not supposed to do? Don't say you're going to burn in hell. Well, how come that doesn't always work with people? So here we go. If you recognize this, we saw this all the way back in chapter 6 of Zelu Mazeh. This opposite this. The same way that we have 248 positive commandments that unite us with God, there are 365 prohibitive thou shalt nots. Crossing those, transgressing in those, if they don't unite us with God, what is the opposite? Zelu Mazeh. They actually create a separation. So when we affirm the unity of God, we say God is the only existing being. Everything in this world is God. Different manifestations of God, but it's all God. Nothing separates from Him. There is only Him. Connecting with God and doing Torah mitzvahs, that comes from a level of what we call self-nullification or bittul. Because whatever I want is irrelevant to what God wants. God says, I want you to hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and you're like, well, I don't like the noise. Well, too bad. God wants you to hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, or whatever it is. This is the mitzvah that God wants from you, and it's not a matter of whatever you want. We're not denying that you might want something else. See, that's also crucial, because sometimes people think, oh, the fact that I want something else. I didn't really get to flesh out the argument, but someone was saying, don't you think this is important because people are feeling this way? No one's denying the feeling. The problem is that this path that we're on right now allows the feeling to become action. Is basically, so that we didn't really get to finish the argument, but that was kind of what it was. And afterwards, it was very upsetting to think about it because everyone, especially these days, is starting to like, well, this is my truth and this is my feeling. Well, first of all, it's not your truth, it's your perception of truth. So let's distinguish that. And second of all, what does that have to do with action? No one's denying that this might be a struggle. Yes, agreed. And so it's a struggle, so you don't have to do it? No. That's why connection, the uniting with God, comes from a place of self-nullification. Even though I don't want to, I'm not in the mood, I don't like it, but I'm going to do it anyways because this is the affirmation of God's unity. Because I am a believer, not just a believer, I'm a knower. I know that God is it. So I'm going to do what He wants from me. Idolatry, on the other hand, remember we spoke about the first two of the Sarasat Dibros, the first two of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God, thou shalt not have any other gods. Idolatry, in its broader sense, it's not just bowing down to an idol, but it's allowing for an existence that is beyond and separate from God. Why? Because saying no is, this is what I want. No, that means that there's now an option for something else, which is why it's not connection, it's separation. And where the separation comes from ego. We already said kind of a couple chapters ago that idolatry stems from a sense of arrogance. We usually think of arrogance as, well, arrogant kind of people. But in the broader sense of arrogance is any sense of self that asserts itself over God. It's any sense of self that asserts itself over what must be done. Especially in Chassidus when we talk about arrogance. Which is why even if someone's not specifically an arrogant person, they can still work on themselves in this regard of arrogance, of trying to remove totally from themselves any sense of, well, I said so. Well, this is what I want. So that's why it's not arrogance in the more defined aspect of it. But in a more personal sense, we all have that part of us that gets a little bit, why did they say no to me? That's arrogance. That's a sense of self. Or like, why are you disagreeing with me? Or you must be wrong, you're done, or this, that, whatever, because you're not in line with what I want. It can be something so simple, like I want the shoes here and not there. Your idea might be better, but the fact that we get bothered by it and stuff like that, that's ego. That's a sense of self. So that allows for, God forbid, the separation that could occur through idolatry. The saying that there is something other than a power, a deity. It's not a denial of God, it's a denial of God's oneness within the world. And that's also very specific. So here's something that's very important. And this is what makes this chapter the chapter that people want to skip. Because it tells us the truth about what occurs. When a person transgresses, when a person does what they're not supposed to do, they're taking their precious gift of free will and they are basically perverting it and becoming less than that which was already created to be evil. What do we mean by that? Sitra Achara, that's the other side. We have holiness, now we have Sitra Achara, the other side. Anything that is not holiness. Sitra Achara is Sitra Achara because God created it to be Sitra Achara. The fact that this is the other side, this is evil, forbidden, temptation, desire, whatever it is, God created it to be so. So the fact that this acts right now in its own capacity, it is being what it was created to be. It doesn't have a choice in the matter. Envy has to be envy. God created envy to be envy. Envy's not like, look, wait a second. I want to be kindness today. Down here in this world, there is no argument. Envy is envy. Envy is a terrible thing. Yes, we all agree to that. But envy is being envy. We're using something that's a little bit intangible, but take it for anything. Why is a pig a pig? Because a pig was created to be a pig. It doesn't have a choice to be a sheep. The pig is not like, listen, okay, I'm tired of this mud business. I want to be a bird so I can get out of the mud. No, you can't. You are a pig, and you were created to be a pig. You can't get mad at a pig for being a pig. It's like the story of the Rambam, where the advisors were like, can you train a cat to be like a human? And the Rambam's like, no chance. They're like, yes, you could. And right, they trained the cat to serve and be a butler and da-da-da. What did the Rambam do? He took out a mouse and he set it free, and the cat went running. Because the cat's going to be a cat. People are so surprised when the dog bites. Why are you surprised? It's being a dog. If anything, you should be impressed about the fact that the training held up for so long. But you shouldn't be surprised when the dog acts like a dog. There's certain people that go to their house, their dogs start barking, they start rolling their eyes. Oh, they're so annoying. You chose to have a dog. Why are you surprised that your dog's going to bark at every single person that passes by your gate? Why are you shocked by this? It is a dog. Sitra Achara was created to be Sitra Achara. There is no free choice. Any klipa is a negative force. We have white and black in the gray zone. So white is holiness, the black within the gray zone, the negative aspects of the gray zone. When it's not on a body, it can't rebel. A klipa does not rebel, as in saying, I'm specifically going to do something opposite God. They create challenges, they create veils, obfuscations, etc. But this is because this is what they were created to be. You can't get mad at Satan for being Satan because Satan was created to be Satan. Satan didn't rebel. The Satan was made to be a prosecuting angel. Well, we can get mad at him because we don't like what he does, but this is what he was created to be. That's why you have the language of Tanya. It knows its master and it does not rebel against it. This is what it talks about with the negative forces. However, what about a person? An animal soul that's enclosed within a body has free choice. The free choice allows us to become more or less than we were created to be. As in, when we go beyond the temptations and desires, we're now more than our natural state. But when we transgress, we become less than our natural state, which means that we have become less than Klipa and Sitra Achara in the moment of transgression. They are only being that which they were created to be. We were created to be the foremost among all creation. We were created to choose life, to choose God. Our capacities are infinite. We can actually choose. They cannot choose. So the fact that we choose wrong is not just you chose wrong right now. You have now fallen lower than that which has no choice. Think about it sometimes when you're disciplining kids. Especially when the good kid does something bad, you're like even more flustered when the troublemaker does something bad. Because you're so much more than that. You're so much smarter than that. If that's just a smart person, how can you make such a stupid decision? How can you tell us that you're better than that? We are better than that because we have free choice. This is what occurs in a moment of sin. God forbid. In the Klipa and Sitra Achara, going more into from their perspective of things, their internal life force is in a state of exile. So they regard themselves kind of as gods, and God is the God of gods. Hashem is the God of gods. The Klipa and Sitra Achara, the fact that they're this veil, they're not denying God. What they're denying, what we said last time, is they're denying more hashgacha pratis. They're denying more the personal involvement of God within our lives. They don't deny that God created the world. God created the world, and then there's also us, and we also have superpowers. We're also in control of things. That's what their perspective is. We, in a moment of sin, God forbid, we are actually denying God's unity. It's not that we got confused in our perception of things. It's actually a denial of what the truth of reality is. Now, we come to a very interesting example that's brought down, and this is something that the Alter Rebbe is going to use to show us how can a person actually come to sin, especially when we know this kind of stuff. We've sort of been to this before about kind of toe the line until you're made to go across the line, the Chassidus that comes over a person. But here we have the example that says, Kisiste ishto, when a wife will turn astray. It brings the example of an isha sota, a woman who's suspected of adultery. Adultery is one of the big three. We say adultery, but it's really any sort of relationship that's forbidden. Falls into that category. Anything thou shalt not when it comes to relationships kind of falls into this category. But it's idolatry, all the forbidden relationship stuff, rather be killed than to transgress on any one of these three. Now, it doesn't say that about other mitzvahs of the Torah, so what's going on here? The Alter Rebbe says that if you would go up to the adulterous woman, say, hey, bow down to an idol, she'd say, what are you, crazy? I would never bow down to an idol. And you're like, what? You're an adulteress. And she's like, yeah, but bowing down to an idol, that's a denial of God. And I would never do that. But you committed adultery. What do you mean? And she's like, no, it's not the same thing. What do you mean, no, it's not the same thing? They're on the level. No, one denies God and one's just a personal transgression. One's just a decision that I make, whatever. This is what we mean that we say, En Adam over Vera, from the Gemara, that a person doesn't transgress unless a spirit of folly enters him. What is the spirit of folly that comes over a person? It's an equivocation. It's a way of saying this one is not as bad as this one. This is what we do. The adulteress says adultery is not as bad as idolatry. Because one's an absolute denial of God, and the other one is just between me and somebody else. The misconception, the spirit of folly that comes over us says that there's a difference in the sins that are committed. It says that there's a difference between this sin and that that's it. It goes back to Parshas Eikev. Eikev is Shema that Rashi explains that there are mitzvahs that we trample under our heel because we say, oh, these are not as important. But the Alter Rebbe says, look, when it comes to idolatry, that's a direct challenge of the faith, so the woman's going to resist that. Or any sort of sinner, someone who embezzles funds. Anybody does anything they're not supposed to do. When it comes to idolatry, they're like, no. Direct denial of God, I would never do something like that. But when it comes to a sin that's a matter of a temptation for gratification, self-pleasure or something like that, indulgence, something that they don't see it like that, that's when the spirit of folly comes in. They're like, no. This is not a direct denial of God. Eating treif or whatever it is, that's just you. No one gets hurt in the eating treif. That's not a big deal. That's not denying God. You still believe in God. You're not bound down to an idol. Whatever the sin is that you could put there. What happens is we create distinctions between the prohibitions. The distinctions between idolatry versus adultery, which is the example that's brought down here. But you can use it for anything. Idolatry versus whatever. Whatever versus whatever. I would never do that. Oh, this is not so bad. And this is the spirit of fall that comes over us. When we say that Ruach Shtus comes over us, it's when we say this one is not like this one. That one separates me from God. That one's a denial of God. This one is not. This is what we get to. Well, just an answer, we'll skip a little bit. The Alter Rebbe brings an example of shochet. A shochet is someone who has to be Shomer Shabbos, can't be an idolater or anything like that. It says nothing there about sexual promiscuity. It's not a disqualification for shochet. Interesting. It also says, Torah says you should violate, you should actually desecrate Shabbos for this one person so that they should be able to fulfill other Shabbos. Whether or not we know they're going to do it, we have to violate Shabbos. So what are we looking at here? Isn't Shabbos so important? A person can't become a shochet if they're not Shomer Shabbos. And yet all of a sudden, we see here that you're allowed to violate Shabbos in order to save someone's life. So it seems like these mitzvahs are not adding up. We use Shabbos to tell us what kosher we're allowed to eat. Why isn't that one of the big three? Shabbos should be one of the big three. Look at how important it is. You can't eat in someone's house who's not Shomer Shabbos if you want to keep true kosher. People think kosher is just meat and milk. Well, no, it's not. There is a lot to that. Why is that not more strict? Food becomes part of your body. We should be very strict about that. It seems like we're equivocating here. What about certain mitzvahs that have capital punishment? Some mitzvahs, you'll give them a bunch of lashes. So maybe the one that get a bunch of lashes are not so bad. You're only getting lashes for it. It seems that there's a difference in these mitzvahs, which is what we put into our minds as well. There is a difference in the mitzvahs, and straight up, we can see it in the punishment for the mitzvahs. That one's capital punishment, and that one is not. Obviously, it means that the mitzvahs don't carry the same weight. That's what we tell ourselves. The mitzvahs don't carry the same weight because the punishments are different. Because who's affected is different. These are the rational lies. This is how we rationalize. So the Alter Rebbe says, first of all, it's only the after part. It's only after the sin has been committed that it comes out different. It's not during the moment of sin. During the moment of sin, of transgression, whatever that transgression is, there is a breach. There is a separation from God that occurs in that moment. It doesn't matter how quote unquote big or small the sin is, there is a breach that occurs in that moment. And in that breach moment, in that moment of separation, we fall lower than the Sitra Achara and Klipa and all the negative forces. Everything that's impure and unholy, you're less than a pig in that moment. Because a pig was made to be a pig, and you were not. You were made to choose, and you have the capacity for free choice. You have a mind that could create a moral code, and you know better than that. This is why we fall lower in a moment of sin. And this is something that, imagine if we could actually keep it in mind when we're faced with any some sort of temptation, desire, whatever, that if we could always bear in mind about what the real point of everything is, our lives would be absolutely different. Every single time you had a temptation for something and you thought for a second, I'm going to be less than a pig, like, no, I don't want to be less than a pig. Here that gives the example of Yatash Kadamach. The gnat was created before you. First of all, on the simple explanation, because the days of the week, the days of creation, Thursday the insects were created and Friday man was created. Oh, even the gnat came before you, someone who's arrogant. Oh, you're such a big deal? Even a gnat was created before you for creation. Did God create the whole world to set it up for man? Is there something like this that you could tell someone, don't think you're so big because even gnats were created before you? Now, why does he use an example of a gnat? A gnat is considered the epitome of Sitra Achara. A gnat is considered the epitome of ego and selfishness because it takes and it doesn't excrete. It just burns everything off or something like that. It doesn't even give a crap. That's why the gnat, it doesn't even get rid of anything. That's why it's considered the epitome of selfishness, the epitome of Sitra Achara. Even this gnat, that is the example, in that moment of transgression, even that gnat is at a level higher than you. Even that gnat is feeding from the light of life from a place higher than you. Because a gnat was made to be a gnat, and it's only been a gnat. It is not biting the hand that feeds it per se. But you were created to be much more than that. And you are falling lower in that moment of transgression. That's why I have also, when he talks about the animals, it's supposed to be, the fear and dread of you will be upon all the animals. As in, all animals are supposed to be, whoa, don't mess with human beings. These are godly creatures. And then it says after that, lak behema. An animal, a wild animal, will not rule over or will not attack a person unless it seems to be like an animal. Now, that's not to say, the 3-year-old got bit by a dog. What was it? No, okay, don't do that. But the example that it gives is Daniel. Daniel Begovarais, right? Daniel and the lion's den. How come the animals didn't attack? Because the animals see this is a tzaddik. This is a godly person. And the animals know that we are submitted to godly people. The animals have a sense for these things, like Bilam's donkey. The animals could sense it because they're in a lower level than human beings. Their minds wouldn't go crazy the way human beings, we can't process it because we're a little bit too smart to be able to process it. If we started seeing these higher spiritual levels, we just go like, zzz, we'd go on the fritz. But an animal that's a little bit not created with the same intellectual capacity as a human being, if anything, they could see it because the processing is not there for it. Oh my God, what am I seeing right now? These are examples that the Alter Rebbe brings down to say we know that animals are supposed to be subjugated to humans. But at a time of sin, a human is like less than an animal. That is why potentially, not, if then this, we're not saying that. That is why potentially an animal, a wild animal could attack a human being because in that moment, it's not seeing a human being. It's seeing someone that's fallen lower than even its own self, which is very strong language that we're talking about here when we talk about what transgression is. Which again, the spirit of folly doesn't allow us to see this. It says, no, this is not the same kind of separation. This sin and this sin, it's not the same thing. This is a denial of God, and this is just a little oopsies. No, it's not. At the moment of sin and transgression, we are creating a separation. We are, even unwittingly, allowing for a denial of God within that moment. Because we are saying, no, I don't have to do what you want me to do. If there's nothing but God, how can you say that? There is no will but what the master wants. You know what's a good example of this? Havdil. Have you ever read The Remains of the Day? What's the author's name? He lived in Britain. It's a very slim volume. So he's kind of like at the end of the time of the butlers. So I think it's 19 something or other. And there's an American that bought over his previous master's estate. And the whole thing is that you kind of realize that this guy never had a life because he was all about being the best butler ever, even though he's now in the waning days of being a butler. And then it's, I see my new master. He speaks to me in a certain way. This must be like a sense of humor. I think I need to develop a sense of humor so that I can better serve my master. It's a very considered, this is a joke, ha ha ha. And you can see it's not natural for him to be like that, but I must serve my master. When you talk about someone who just molds themselves to somebody else. Now, sometimes we see that as people and we're like, come on, be your own person. Yeah, God wants you to be your own person, but being your own person in service to him. He tells us exactly what the guidelines are. You could do whatever you want within these guidelines. There's room for creativity as long as you follow the rules. So what happens? We tell ourselves this is not like this because we deny, we forget, we cloud over, we fog over the fact that this is a moment of separation. This is a moment of saying it is not all you. You are not the absolute. That is what occurs in a moment of transgression. After the fact, the consequence, the punishment, the cleansing for it might be different. This one has lashes, this one has whatever it is. That might look different because there's some sort of something that God put in place to say that this is the cleansing that has to happen from this kind of sin, transgression. But the moment of transgression is the same for every sin. It's a moment of breakage and separation. What we're supposed to bear in mind is how can I ever be separated? I would never commit idolatry. I would never deny God. Well, every sin is a denial of God's absolute unity within the world. It goes back to the Likutei and Sitra Achara of saying, you're the God of gods. There's more gods and you're just the head honcho. No, there is no gods. There is only God. This is actually, I don't think this idea is actually introduced in this chapter. I'll bring it in here because it fits here. It talks about how the Jewish person's connection with God is like a rope woven from 613 strands. So anytime we transgress, God forbid, we're fraying that rope. There's a strand there that goes ding. Versus if someone does something that's, God forbid, cursed, it'd be like cutting the rope completely. So how can you jeopardize the rope that binds you to God? Any transgression you do jeopardizes the rope. It frays the rope. Now you can say, well, what about teshuva? So what does teshuva do? Teshuva knots the rope. What happens actually when you knot a rope? You actually make it a little bit shorter. So knotting the rope makes it a little bit shorter. That's why teshuva actually brings us closer to God. But what is a tzaddik supposed to do? Well, you can knot a rope without actually cutting it, can't you? Yes, you can. So what's the difference? This is a knotted rope and that's a knotted rope. Well, do you want to go bungee jumping with the rope that's been cut and knotted? Or would you rather go bungee jumping with a rope that's never been severed? Which rope would you rather go bungee jumping with? So you can say, oh yes, there is teshuva, I could bind the rope, I could come closer for God. Yes, but that is an after the fact. That's not a before the fact of saying, oh, don't worry, we'll be able to knot the rope. Because are you willing to risk that one moment of separation? How can you be willing to risk that moment of separation? How can you be willing to risk one moment of denial of God's absoluteness within the world? Especially because we learned that the hidden love that we have within us, even someone who doesn't seem a practicing Jew will always stand up because the pilot light flames up and is like, no, I would never deny God. Well, every single sin is supposed to be a moment of, no, I will never deny God. How can I deny God? God doesn't want this. He said no. So the fact that someone sinned and they did teshuva and they come closer to God, good. God tells us, yes, you will be forgiven, etc. But the point is from the outset, why would I take that risk? Why would you take the risk of using that rope? If that's the only rope you have, that's the rope you've got. What you should do is that after you did the first knotting of teshuva, so keep trying to knot the rope as much as possible. One knot is good and make sure that there's 1,000 knots in it. As in every day, bring yourself closer and closer to God. Especially because you're going to make sure that rope is never going to get cut again. We will never fray this rope. It's just going to be a rope of knots. Nothing can impede upon it. So do that. But from the outset, if you have a choice between a rope that's been cut and a rope that's never been cut before, which rope would you trust more? For anything. That's why from the outset, we don't want to approach it like that. Just if that happens to occur, we can deal with it. The next thing that it tells us is that when someone's in exile, part of being a captive in exile, it means that they're restricted from expressing their abilities and their ideas, etc. A person can't be their true self while in exile. You might be able to function. The captives are supposed to work. The captives are supposed to eat, sleep, whatever. You can't be your real self. That's the thing about being a captive. Tanya now tells us that there's no greater exile for the divine soul, for the nefesh elokis, than during sin brought on through the actions of the animal soul. The moment that the animal soul leads the body towards sin, toward transgression, the divine soul is in this moment of captivity, which is one of the most unimaginable and hardest things that it has to deal with. Because the divine soul, the nefesh elokis, can't be its real self. The real self wants to do what God wants. It wants to connect to God. In the moment of sin, the animal soul in the body drags it into captivity. That even in a moment of sin, the divine soul is still always connected to God. The divine soul, the nefesh elokis, does not go along with the sin. It's being dragged along, but it doesn't want to be there. It's specifically an animal soul within the body, the nefesh elokis within the body, that can perform a sinful act. Now, it actually says that the ruach shdus, just a side thing, the ruach shdus could cover up a person. It only could come up to the level of chachma. Whereas we learned all the way in the beginning that where's the avam esoteris, where's the hidden love of a person? It's within the level of chachma. So the ruach shdus can't reach it. It can cover up all the way up until chachma, which means that we still have the pilot light that's ready to flare up. We have to flare it up. The last thing that it tells us is that what occurs in the moment of sin is not just captivity. It describes it as because the nefesh elokis comes from chachmila, comes from this higher level of chachma, there's no greater fall for it than fall all the way down into the physical world. And not just you fell down into the physical world, but you fell into a moment of sin within the physical world. You're dragging something that's from the highest heights and you're dragging it to the lowest of lows. And what's the example I give? It's like you're taking the head of the king and it's like you put it, Tanya tells us, in a privy full of filth. What you're doing to the godly soul, the piece of God that you have within you, the way you're schlepping it down is like literally if you could take a king's head and you're sticking it into the privy full of filth. You're shoving it into the garbage. This is what occurs in a moment of sin. And that's actually the note that this chapter ends off with. We're going to do a little bit more in the next chapter, and then the next chapter, though, ends off in a much more positive note before we actually go into all the things about all the challenges that we face on a day-to-day basis. But the main bullet point of this chapter is that part of what causes a person to sin is, first of all, they don't realize what occurs in the moment of sin, and also because we think that because some mitzvahs seem bigger than others, or some mitzvahs seem to have more severity, or some transgressions seem to have more severity than others, then some are not as bad as the other. And all that is, it's a spirit of fall that's come over, it's the ruach shdus, the spirit of fall that's come over us that allows us to believe that. And what we have to remember is that it's not true. Any transgression or any sin, or any time we go into temptation, which could lead to sin, no matter how big or small, quote unquote, it seems to us, any moment of that creates a moment of separation. Any moment that creates a denial of God's absoluteness within the world. And in that moment, we are lower than even the negative forces and the evil force within the world. It should disturb us a little bit and shake us a little bit to try to keep us on track and make sure you got to put in the fight to do what we're supposed to be doing.